Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey through the corridors of time. Tonight, we drift back more than 2,000 years to a world of sand and stone, of gods and golden crowns, where the air was thick with incense and the stars guided both farmers and pharaohs. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. A tale of ancient dynasties and divine rivers, of Greek kings and Roman generals, of beauty, wit, ambition, and the end of a world 3,000 years in the making. A world where temples whispered the names of forgotten gods, where power danced behind silken veils, and where one woman dared to rule between empires. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let the nighttime historian take you back to the slow, eternal shores of the Nile. Before Cleopatra, before the Ptolemies, before Rome even dreamed of empire, there was the Nile. Every year as the stars wheeled above the desert skies, a miracle unfolded across the sands of Egypt. The great river, dark and coiled like an ancient serpent, would rise, swelling with distant rains from the heart of Africa. It would spill over its banks, not in fury, but in quiet abundance, blessing the land with rich, silty earth. Life came not in conquest nor in haste, but in rhythm, in patience, in eternal return. This rhythm was the heartbeat of Egypt. To the people who lived along its banks, the Nile was not just a river, it was the lifeline between worlds, between the red land of the desert and the black land of fertile soil, between the living and the dead, between the mundane and the divine. Its regular flooding, so dependable and mysterious, was considered the work of gods. It gave them crops, it gave them time, it gave them purpose. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, after the rich earth left behind by the floods, and they called their nation Eternal, not in arrogance, but in observation. Seasons passed, kings came and went, even dynasties faded, but the Nile flowed on, constant, eternal. Villages clustered along its banks like beads on a thread. Farmers rose before the sun to tend their barley and emmer wheat, working with hands that understood both the generosity and the discipline of the land. Fishermen cast nets into the shallows, and boatmen poled silent vessels past temples whose painted stones had already witnessed centuries. Trade moved on the river, just as prayers did. Offerings floated to temples, fish to market, grain to granaries, and death too journeyed the Nile. Bodies were ferried westward to the land of the setting sun, to tombs carved into the stone hills of eternity. Even time itself was measured by the river. The Egyptian calendar, the first truly solar calendar, began not with a Roman decree or a Greek oracle, but with the heliacal rising of Sirius. When the dog star appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn, it heralded the coming flood, the start of the new year, and the rebirth of the land. This connection between water, time, stars, and soul is what made Egypt Egypt. A civilization not forged in haste but cultivated like the lotus over millennia, grown slowly, beautifully, deliberately, and it was into this old, sacred rhythm that Cleopatra was born. A girl not of the desert, nor of Greek isles, but of the river's slow pulse. Though her blood would be Macedonian, her soul would belong to the Nile. The Nile may have given Egypt its lifeblood, but it was the stone, shaped, carved, and consecrated, that preserved its soul. From the sands of Upper Egypt, To the delta's fertile edge, temples rose like mountains of faith, each one a sacred heartbeat, a dwelling place of gods and a bridge between the divine and the mortal world. These were not mere places of worship. They were cosmic machines designed with mathematical precision, aligned with celestial rhythms, and inscribed with prayers older than memory. Columns towered like papyrus stalks, lotus blooms opened in painted relief, and walls told stories in sacred script of Horus the falcon, of Osiris reborn, of Isis weeping for her lost love. Through these halls moved priests and pilgrims, offering incense and song, tending to statues as if they were living gods, anointed each day with oils and linen, fed with bread and beer. To the Egyptians, the gods lived among them, and their temples were literal homes. But if the temples were for the gods, the tombs were for the kings, and nowhere spoke louder of eternity than the Valley of the Kings. Long before Cleopatra, in the time of great pharaohs like Ramses and Hatshepsut, tombs had been carved deep into the stone hills of the west, the land of sunset and death. There, in the dry silence of the cliffs, the rulers of Egypt prepared for the journey beyond life, not just with gold and treasure, but with magic spells, sacred texts, and maps for the soul. The Book of the Dead, with its hymns and passwords, was placed beside the deceased. Painted on walls were scenes of judgment, the heart weighed against the feather of Maat. And everywhere, the eye of Horus watched, a ward against chaos, a symbol of wholeness. Egyptians believed in a world after this one, not vague or abstract, but vivid and orderly. The soul, if pure, would sail with Ra across the heavens. If impure, it would be devoured by the demon Amit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. To live forever, one had to be remembered, and one had to be prepared. So they built for forever, temples that still stand after millennia, tombs whose paint remains vibrant though their builders have long since turned to dust, obelisks that pierce the sky like frozen sunbeams. Time in Egypt did not move like a river rushing forward. It moved in circles, in cycles, flood, harvest, drought, birth, death, rebirth. It is no wonder, then, that Cleopatra, raised in a palace of marble and papyrus scrolls, grew up with the weight of this time behind her. She was not just a queen, she was heir to gods, to pyramids, to a kingdom where the past was never past. To live in ancient Egypt was to live under the gaze of gods, not distant, cold deities, but ever-present beings woven into every part of life, from the arc of the sun to the flood of the Nile, from the turning of seasons to the beating of a heart. Above all, the world was governed by Maat, a word, a goddess, a concept, and a cosmic law. Maat was truth, justice, balance, and harmony. It was the order that kept the stars in the sky and the river in its course, the force that separated life from chaos, cosmos from void. Without Maat, the world would unravel, and so every Egyptian, from farmer to pharaoh, lived with the solemn responsibility of upholding it. The gods were many, each with their own realms and forms. Ra, the sun god who sailed his golden bark across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. Isis, the mother and mourner, divine in magic and healing. Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the afterlife, whose resurrection promised eternal life. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the heavens, keeper of knowledge and time. There was Bastet, the protective cat goddess, and Sekhmet, the lioness of war, Hathor, who danced joy into the world, and Anubis, who stood watch over the dead. Their forms were animal and human, fierce and gentle, nurturing and terrifying, a divine family as complex as the people who worshipped them. To please the gods was to ensure the cycle continued. The flood would come, the crops would grow, the sun would rise again. Temples were not mere places of devotion, they were engines of cosmic maintenance, where priests performed rituals daily to nourish the divine and renew the sacred bond. Statues were not symbols, they were vessels, offerings of food, incense, and song were not gestures. They were necessities, as vital as rainfall. And at the very top of this spiritual order stood the Pharaoh, not just a king, but a god on earth, the living Horus, the son of Ra, and the upholder of Ma'at. His rule was more than political, it was metaphysical. His failures could bring famine, his victories, abundance. Even in death, the Pharaoh remained central, becoming one with Osiris and passing into eternity, joining the unbroken chain of divine kingship. By Cleopatra's time, the names of the old gods still rang out in temple halls, though Greek influence had softened some edges and renamed some faces. Yet the principle of Ma'at endured, balance, order, continuity, and Cleopatra, though born of a foreign dynasty, understood it intimately. To reign in Egypt was to dance between heaven and earth, to serve the gods and be one with them, to carry the weight of eternity with grace, in a land older than history, where even time bowed to divine law. Ma'at was the silent breath that held it all together, invisible but everywhere. To rule Egypt was not to simply sit upon a throne. It was to become a cosmic force, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal, the human and the divine. The Pharaoh was more than a sovereign. He was a god made flesh, the living Horus by day, and in death, the resurrected Osiris. His word upheld Ma'at, his rituals nourished the gods, and his image, carved into walls, painted in ochre and gold, raised high in colossi, served as a constant reminder of divine presence on earth. His body was sacred, his bloodline a thread that stretched back through time to the first kings, and further still, to the gods themselves. Even the crown he wore bore meaning, the red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, together forming the double crown of a united land. Each regalia, the crook, the flail, the urious serpent, spoke to roles both pastoral and fierce, protector and avenger. Yet all this power, all this grandeur, was aimed not just at life, but at what came after. For to an Egyptian, death was not an end, but a transformation. The afterlife, the field of reeds, was a mirror of the living world, fertile and everlasting, where the blessed dead could farm, fish, and feast for eternity. But the journey there was perilous. First came the judgment. The heart, believed to hold the soul, was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, it would be devoured by Amit, the soul lost forever. But if it was pure, the soul passed on, joining the eternal cycle. To prepare for this journey, the Pharaoh underwent careful embalming, surrounded by sacred texts, amulets, and offerings. His tomb was not just a resting place, it was a machine of resurrection, filled with spells from the pyramid texts or the Book of the Dead, designed to guide and protect him in the underworld. Every color on the wall, every position of a statue, every alignment of a chamber had purpose, resonating with cosmic geometry and mythic meaning. Even the act of building, the quarrying of stone, the shaping of corridors was a ritual in itself. In this way, death became a second coronation, a rebirth among the stars. This belief endured for millennia, its echoes still heard in Cleopatra's time, though now the burial places had moved, the gods had new names, and the tombs were smaller, hidden, but the soul of the practice remained. Cleopatra, like her ancestors, knew that her life was only half the story. The other half would be written in eternity. To be a pharaoh was to rule with one hand in this world and the other in the next, to govern the living and prepare for the great voyage beyond. In Egypt, time was not a straight road, but a wheel, and every king, every queen, turned it forward with the weight of all who had come before. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had ruled itself through drought and flood, war and plenty, under kings who spoke its tongue and knew its gods. Its temples echoed with prayers older than memory. Its pharaohs were born of the land, buried in its soil, and bound to the sun and stars by sacred law. Dynasties had risen and fallen, yet the Nile endured, and the world seemed unchanging, eternal. But eternity, as it turned out, could be interrupted, not by time, but by a man. He came not from the desert, nor from the delta, but from the cold mountains of the north, a foreign king with a lion's stride and a gaze fixed on the horizon. No one in Egypt had called for him. And yet, when he came, young, divine, unstoppable, the land did not resist. It opened its arms, and so began a new chapter in Egypt's long story, one shaped not by priests or pyramids, but by the shadow of a conqueror whose ghost would never quite leave. In the late 4th century before our common era, long before Cleopatra opened her eyes to the Nile, the sands of Egypt stirred under the sandals of a foreign king, young, golden-haired, and burning with the impossible ambition to conquer the world. Alexander of Macedon arrived in Egypt not as an invader, but as a liberator. The Persians, who had ruled Egypt as absentee overlords for generations, were cast aside like shadows at dawn. The Egyptians, weary of distant rulers who neither knew their gods nor walked their temples, welcomed this stranger as a savior. And Alexander, brilliant, theatrical, ever conscious of myth, stepped into their adoration as if it had always been waiting for him. He travelled to the great oracle of Amun at Siwa, far out in the western desert, where the priests declared him not merely king, but divine, the son of Amun, the living god. In that moment, he did not just conquer Egypt, he became Egypt. And then, with that as his foundation, he did what gods and kings before him had never dreamed. He founded a city, Alexandria, not in the mold of Thebes or Memphis, but something altogether new. A gleaming Hellenistic jewel on the Mediterranean coast, with wide boulevards, white marble colonnades, a lighthouse that would one day be counted among the wonders of the world, and a library that would try to gather all human knowledge under one roof. But for all his vision, Alexander would not linger. Within a few short years, the conqueror was dead, struck down not on a battlefield but in a fevered bed in Babylon, his empire vast, brilliant, and utterly unprepared for what came next. He left no heir, only generals and ambition, his empire shattered like glass, its pieces claimed by those who had followed him through war and glory. Egypt fell to one of those men, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, Alexander's trusted bodyguard, a man of shrewd intelligence and ruthless patience. While others clawed at each other for power in the east, Ptolemy sailed to Egypt and made it his, not as a satrap, not as a governor, but as Pharaoh. He stole Alexander's body, hijacked the funeral procession meant to carry it to Macedonia, and buried it instead in Alexandria, a political masterstroke that made Egypt the eternal resting place of the god-king, and himself his closest inheritor. From that act rose a dynasty, the Ptolemies, that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. They were Greek in language, Greek in blood, but draped themselves in Egyptian custom. They built temples to the old gods, styled themselves as divine, even married their own siblings like the pharaohs of old. But beneath the gold and incense, they remained outsiders, monarchs, playing at being gods in a land that tolerated them, even venerated them, but never quite forgot that they were strangers. And so the ghost of Alexander lingered in the columns of Alexandria, in the lineage of its rulers, in the contradiction at the heart of Cleopatra's world. A Macedonian girl, born 300 years after his death, would one day try to revive the legacy he left behind, even as the world he had reshaped began to collapse beneath her feet. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, had not been born to wear a crown. He had not dreamed as Alexander did, nor burned with visions of conquering the world. But he understood something deeper, something colder. He understood power and permanence. While the other generals of Alexander tore the empire into pieces, bleeding the east with war and betrayal, Ptolemy looked to Egypt. He saw not just land, but legacy, a kingdom already ancient, wealthy, steeped in divine order and old obedience, and he saw in it something that could outlast the chaos. So he settled there, quietly at first, ruling as satrap, paying lip service to the distant heirs of Alexander, but slowly, steadily, he claimed Egypt as his own. And then he declared himself Pharaoh. It was not a title the Greeks gave lightly, but Ptolemy understood that to rule Egypt, one must become Egypt. And so began the performance, the long and careful illusion, or perhaps the transformation. He appeared in temples, offered sacrifices to Ra, Osiris, and Isis. He presented himself as the living Horus, the protector of Ma'at, and in time, the Egyptians accepted him, or at least accepted the shape he had chosen to wear. But beneath the alabaster mask of Pharaoh, Ptolemy remained a Greek. Alexandria was his true capital, not Thebes, not Memphis, a city born of Greek geometry and Macedonian pride, with scholars, merchants, philosophers, and towering monuments of imported stone. It was here that he built the great library, a temple to reason rather than religion, a place where scrolls were gathered from every known land, where ideas were studied, copied, debated, lost, and rediscovered. It is said that the library held hundreds of thousands of texts, histories, poems, astronomy, medicine, magic, even dreams, all catalogued in the flickering lamplight of its halls. In Alexandria, Egyptian religion remained, but now it mingled with the Olympians, and the lines began to blur. Ptolemy and his priests introduced a new god, Serapis, part Greek, part Egyptian, crowned with grain, holding a scepter of both worlds. A deity made not by heaven, but by committee, designed to unify cultures and consolidate control. The Ptolemies, those who followed the first, would continue this act of balancing, or perhaps juggling, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt while speaking Greek in their courts, performing rites to Isis and Osiris, while debating Plato and Aristotle in the gardens. They married their sisters, as the pharaohs of old had done, not out of love, but of legacy, to keep the bloodline unbroken, to present themselves as gods, untainted by common birth. And though the outer shell of Egypt still shimmered with ceremony and sacred order, the core began to rot. The early Ptolemies were strong, capable rulers, temple patrons, builders of cities and armies, but as generations passed, the dynasty grew inward, paranoid, fragile. The court became a nest of plots and poison, siblings killing siblings, mothers turning on sons, lovers against lovers, and yet the performance continued. The temples still stood, the priests still offered incense, the statues still bore the faces of Greek kings carved into the bodies of Egyptian gods. It was into this world, shimmering on the surface, but cracking beneath, that Cleopatra's father was born. The line of Ptolemy had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, Greek in blood, Egyptian in name, forever walking the tightrope between 2 civilizations. They were foreigners, draped in divinity, ruling a land older than memory, a land that remembered what it meant to be ruled by gods, and knew the difference. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty had played its careful game. Gods in Greek skin, cloaked in Egyptian ritual, reigning from the palaces of Alexandria, while pretending to embody the divine will of the Nile. But as the years unfurled, as the line thinned and looped back upon itself in marriages of blood and ambition, the cracks began to show. Brother turned against sister, mother against child. Poison was poured behind tapestries, and plots whispered in the marbled halls of Alexandria's royal court. The later Ptolemies ruled less like pharaohs and more like stage actors, repeating the lines of old, but with trembling voices. The grandeur remained, but the strength was fading. Into this fragile lineage came Ptolemy the 12th, a man who called himself Neos Dionysos, the new Dionysus, but whom history would remember more quietly as Orlets, the flute player. He was a man of indulgence, music, lavish ceremony, but little authority. Egypt, by then, no longer moved to the rhythm of its own desires. Rome loomed over everything, hungering for grain, gold, and influence. Ptolemy paid for their favor, dearly, draining Egypt's coffers to bribe Roman senators, trading coin for stability, and with it, sowing seeds of resentment. The people saw not a divine king, but a debtor, a man propped up by foreign blades, a shadow in borrowed robes. At one point, driven out by revolt, he fled into exile, leaving behind his children, his throne, and his country teetering on the edge. But with Roman backing, he returned, bloodier, colder, but no stronger. When he died in 51 BCE, he left behind not a stable kingdom, but a trembling inheritance, split between 2 of his children, a girl of 18 and a boy of 10. Her name was Cleopatra. His Ptolemy the 13th bound together in marriage, as custom demanded, but divided in spirit. From the moment they inherited the double crown, the court began to split. Advisors, generals, priests, choosing sides. The throne, though shared in name, tilted back and forth like a boat on the Nile. Each child was watched closely, neither trusted fully. Cleopatra, brilliant, multilingual, fiercely educated, had learned to read Egyptian, to speak to priests in their own tongue, to move through rituals not just as performance, but with understanding. Her brother, still a child, became a pawn in other hands, and slowly, inevitably, those hands began to close around the palace gates. And so the legacy of Alexander, of Ptolemy, of 3 centuries of fragile majesty, came to rest on a narrow knife's edge in the hearts of 2 children, raised in marble halls, surrounded by betrayal, and watched by the ever-hungry eyes of Rome. Cleopatra was just 18 when the weight of 3,000 years settled onto her shoulders. She did not inherit a kingdom. She inherited a question, whispered in temple courts and marble halls alike. Could a girl rule Egypt while Rome watched from across the sea, and her brother sharpened knives behind closed doors? By blood, by custom. Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII were married, king and queen in name, but one was a woman grown, the other a boy of 10, and behind the boy stood men, courtiers, generals, priests, whose loyalties curved like reeds in the river. Cleopatra saw what was coming. She had read the stories of brothers poisoned, of queens smothered in their sleep. She knew that crowns could turn to shackles and siblings into enemies. And so she acted. At first, she ruled with careful grace, appearing alone on royal coinage, conducting diplomacy in her own name, speaking to priests in Egyptian, to scholars in Greek, and to Roman envoys in Latin. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in centuries to speak the native tongue of her people. And they noticed, but so did her brother's advisors. And soon, the tension became open war. Cleopatra was pushed from Alexandria, exiled from her own palace, forced to flee into the desert lands east of the Nile. While her brother's guardians seized power in his name, Cleopatra gathered her own forces, but swords and soldiers were not enough. What she needed was a greater ally. And that ally was already approaching Egypt, carried by the wings of ambition and the shadow of a murdered dictator. Julius Caesar had arrived in Alexandria, not to mediate a sibling dispute, but in pursuit of Pompey, his former ally turned rival. But when Caesar came ashore, he was greeted not by Pompey, but by news of his execution, a gift from Ptolemy XIII's court, meant to win Caesar's favor, but it backfired. Caesar, cold and calculating, saw not loyalty, but arrogance, a child king meddling in the affairs of Rome. He remained in Alexandria, and the city held its breath. And then, in one of the most enduring tales in all of history, Cleopatra made her move. Under the cover of night, she was smuggled into Caesar's presence, legend says, wrapped in a linen sack, or hidden inside a rug, unrolled before the Roman general like a treasure or a challenge. What he saw was not just a queen in exile, but a woman of wit, charm, and boldness. Cleopatra did not plead. She performed. She spoke of her lineage, of her father's friendship with Rome, of her vision for Egypt, and perhaps of more. What passed between them in that private chamber, only they would ever truly know. But by morning, the course of Egypt and Rome had shifted. Cleopatra was restored, not by her brother's consent, but by Caesar's will. He declared her queen, guardian of Maat, and ally of Rome, and with Roman legions behind her, the young queen marched back into Alexandria, not in silence, but in ceremony. A civil war followed, brief, bloody, and final. Ptolemy XIII, still only a boy, drowned in the Nile as he tried to flee the city. His royal diadem found tangled in the reeds, and so Cleopatra, survivor of plots, exile, and civil war, stood alone atop the throne, not as half a monarch, not as a child bride, but as Pharaoh, ruler of Egypt, in her own right. But even then, the danger had not passed. Her crown was a Roman gift, and Rome does not give without asking. Cleopatra knew that to rule in a Roman world, she would need more than titles and temples. She would need allies. She would need heirs. And she would need to become more than a queen. She would become a legend. The storm had passed, but the sky had not cleared. Cleopatra sat upon the throne once more, not alone, but watched. Her power restored, her brother gone, her enemies silent for now. And yet, all of it had come at a price. That price was Julius Caesar. The Roman general remained in Alexandria, not just as a guest, but as an occupying force. His legions settled into the city's bones. His word carried weight in court, in council, in every whispered conversation. Cleopatra, brilliant as she was, knew the difference between victory and independence. Still, she understood Caesar. She understood ambition and how to nurture it. What began as an alliance soon became something more. In Cleopatra, Caesar saw not just a queen, but a symbol, a monarch who could dazzle the East, speak with grace, rule with poise. She was the embodiment of empire, but not his own. And in Caesar, Cleopatra saw protection, power, and perhaps a future. They became lovers, not in secret, but in spectacle. Alexandria whispered Rome would one day roar. They travelled together along the Nile, drifting past temples older than any Roman god, escorted by priests, soldiers, musicians, the Queen of Egypt, and the most powerful man in Rome, sailing through the heart of a kingdom reborn. It was a performance, political, theatrical, divine. And then, from that union came a child, a boy, named Ptolemy 15, but known to the world as Caesarion, the little Caesar. His birth was more than a personal matter. It was a statement of lineage, of legitimacy, of empire stretching from the Tiber to the Nile. But the world was not ready, and neither was Rome. Cleopatra travelled to the Eternal City, bringing Caesarion, her ships, her treasure, and her presence. She lived in a villa outside the city walls, a queen in exile, but not in silence. Her arrival stirred curiosity, then scandal. Rome's conservative heart balked at her luxury, her beauty, her closeness to Caesar. He already had a Roman wife, but that did not stop him from dining with Cleopatra, walking with her, treating her as royalty. Statues were erected in her honor. Rumors whispered that Caesar would name himself king, would elevate Caesarion, would move Rome's soul to Alexandria, to the Senate, This was heresy. To Octavian, Caesar's great nephew and adopted son, it was a threat. And then came the Ides of March. Caesar stabbed on the Senate floor, 23 wounds beneath a statue of Pompey, the dream of empire, of a united East and West, of Cleopatra by his side, died in the dust. In the chaos that followed, Cleopatra fled Rome, returning to Egypt with her child, her grief, and her throne still intact. But the world had changed. Rome descended into civil war, and the alliances that Cleopatra would now need would not be built on admiration or affection, but on survival. In the years after Caesar's death, Cleopatra stood not just as Queen of Egypt, but as custodian of something far older and far more essential. She ruled not only with pageantry and myth, but with something even Rome could not ignore: grain. Egypt, flooded by the Nile, enriched by black silt and steady sun, had become the granary of the ancient world. From Alexandria's great harbours, fleets of ships sailed northward, their hulls heavy with wheat, barley, and oil. These were not gifts, they were leverage. Rome was vast, hungry and restless. A shortage in grain could shake the streets, spark riots, unseat consuls. Cleopatra understood this and used it. Her kingdom was rich in more than food. It held papyrus, glass, gold from Nubian mines, perfumes pressed from lilies and myrrh. But it was the grain, humble, endless, vital, that gave her true power. For all of Rome's might, its emperors and generals could not feed their people without her fields. Still, Egypt's wealth was not just material, it was symbolic. In a world fractured by civil war, Cleopatra's Egypt appeared stable, ancient, divine. Her temples still rang with hymns to Isis. Her people still watched the stars, traced omens in the river's rise, honored the old gods with flowers and flame. And at the center of it all stood Cleopatra, not merely a queen, but the living goddess, the mother of Caesar's child, the ruler of the breadbasket of empire. But she knew that this power was fragile. The Roman Republic was crumbling, its alliances twisting, its generals turning on one another like wolves. She had survived one war of succession, and now another was brewing. In the shadows of Caesar's death, 3 men emerged: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, the second triumvirate. Cleopatra, ever watchful, saw in them not masters, but choices. Rome had not finished with her, and she had not finished with Rome. In the eyes of her people, Cleopatra was more than a monarch. She was a presence, a thread between heaven and earth, a living vessel of the divine. In a land where kings were gods, and gods were everywhere, the power to rule did not come from blood alone. It came from the favor of the gods and from the ones who spoke for them, the priests. Long before Rome touched the shores of Egypt, the priests had held sway, keepers of tradition, law, astronomy, medicine, and myth. They guarded the temples of Isis and Horus. They read the stars, interpreted dreams, and anointed kings with sacred oil. To rule Egypt was to honor them, to walk within their rituals, and to be seen not only as chosen, but as divine. Cleopatra understood this. She knew that her Macedonian blood made her foreign in the eyes of many, but her heart beat in rhythm with the old beliefs. She dressed in the robes of Isis, stood in sacred processions, made offerings with her own hands. She spoke Egyptian, the first Ptolemy in generations to do so. She restored shrines, funded temple repairs, and called upon the gods not with borrowed words but with ancient names. Her image was carved into temple walls, not as a conqueror, but as a daughter of Ma'at, as the goddess herself. It was no accident that the priests supported her, or that the people loved her. In a time of foreign influence, shifting borders, and Roman demands, Cleopatra presented herself not as a queen caught between worlds, but as Egypt itself, eternal, beautiful, balanced. The priests in turn gave her more than prayers. They gave her legitimacy, protection, and a living connection to the old soul of the Nile. Even as Rome loomed larger, even as Antony and Octavian fought for control of an empire, Cleopatra walked the temple steps barefoot, cloaked in linen and gold, breathing incense and reciting the same invocations whispered for 1,000 years, and for as long as the gods were with her, the queen still reigned. Mark Antony came to Cleopatra not as a stranger, but as Caesar's shadow, and Caesar's heir in war. He was bold, theatrical, golden-armored and lion-hearted, a man who drank deeply from life and made no apologies for the mess he left behind. Cleopatra had known Roman power through Julius, but Antony was something else. He was not subtle, but he was brilliant, not cautious, but charismatic. And most of all, he was in need. After the Ides of March, Rome had splintered once again. Alliances shifted like desert wind, and Antony, rising in Caesar's absence, now looked to Egypt for strength. Cleopatra, in turn, saw an opportunity. When they met, the courtship was not quiet. It was legendary. Cleopatra arrived to meet Antony on a gilded barge, its sails dyed purple, oars silver-tipped, music floating across the water like perfume. She lay beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Isis herself, with boys fanning her, and girls dressed as cupids at her side. Antony, dazzled, stepped willingly into the myth. Their love, if it was love, bloomed quickly and publicly. She gave him twins, a boy and a girl. He gave her land and promises, and Rome's rising suspicion. Together, they envisioned something greater than alliance, a shared empire, east and west, old and new. At the donations of Alexandria, Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings, and Caesarion, her son with Julius, the rightful heir of Caesar's legacy. Their children were given titles, lands, crowns not yet won. To the Egyptians it was glorious, to the Romans it was treason. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, watched with quiet fury. In Rome he spread stories of Cleopatra, the sorceress, Antony, the fallen hero, seduced and shackled by a foreign queen. Propaganda took root. Statues were torn down. Rome prepared for war. It came at Actium, a great naval battle off the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet stood against Octavian's, a war not just for power, but for the soul of empire. The battle turned quickly. Cleopatra, sensing collapse, withdrew her ships. Antony followed her. Love or strategy, no one knows. Their forces shattered, their fate sealed. They returned to Egypt not as rulers, but as fugitives. In Alexandria, they waited. The last days of the old world flickering like oil in a dying lamp. For a moment, they held each other above the ruin. But Rome was coming. The end came not with fire or siege, but silence. Antony, hearing false rumors of Cleopatra's death, fell upon his own sword. He did not die immediately. Wounded, bleeding, He was carried to her, his body heavy in her arms, his life slipping like sand between her fingers. They had ruled together, dreamed together, lost together, and now they died together. Soon after, Octavian, the future Augustus, entered Alexandria. He did not sack the city. He claimed it, calmly, methodically, like a man sealing a tomb. Cleopatra, now alone, was brought before him. He did not look at her as Caesar had, nor as Antony had. He saw not a queen, but a problem, a symbol, a story that needed to end. She was watched, guarded, warned not to harm herself, but Cleopatra had ruled too long and too well to let Rome decide the final chapter. In her private chamber, silent, perfumed and filled with fading gold, she prepared for death, as if it were a ritual. The story says she had an asp hidden in a basket of figs, a snake sacred to the gods, a bite that brought death and divinity in one. Some say she used poison, others a hairpin. Some say she died nobly, others theatrically. No one knows for sure. But what is known is that she died on her own terms. Her 2 handmaidens died beside her, 3 women lying in stillness in a world that no longer had room for queens. Octavian arrived too late. He stood over her body, the woman who had defied Rome, seduced its leaders, raised her son to be a king, and nearly succeeded. She was 39 years old, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her son, Caesarion, was captured not long after. Octavian had him executed. No more heirs, no more gods, no more Egypt. The temples would continue, the priests would chant, but the crown was gone. Egypt was no longer a kingdom. It was a province, Roman, ruled by governors, drained for grain, filed into ledgers, Alexandria. Once the light of the world, dimmed beneath marble orders and foreign boots. And with Cleopatra's death, ended not just a reign, but an era. The age of pharaohs, of divine blood, sacred law, living gods and eternal stone, passed into myth. The desert winds carried her name. The world moved on, and history, quietly, fell asleep. History is not kind to powerful women, especially those who rule with beauty and intellect and fire. After her death, Cleopatra's story did not sleep. It was seized, reshaped, retold, first by Rome, then by centuries of poets, priests, painters, and playwrights. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, knew the power of image. He cast her as a temptress, a foreign seductress, the reason Antony had fallen. In Rome's new myth, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a caution. And yet she refused to vanish. Her name endured, in scrolls, in marble, in whispered fascination. In the hands of Shakespeare, she rose again, proud and tragic, regal to the end. Artists painted her in golden silks, lying beside a coiled asp, surrounded by mystery. Films made her divine, her eyes rimmed in kohl, her voice slow and deliberate, her legend glittering beneath the lights. But behind the veils of myth, the real Cleopatra remains. A ruler who spoke 9 languages, who studied astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, who negotiated with emperors and led armies. A woman who navigated a world carved by men and carved space for herself within it. Today, we do not know where she is buried. Her tomb, if it still exists, lies lost beneath sand or stone, waiting, like so much of her life, obscured but not forgotten. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last daughter of Isis, the last breath of an empire that had endured for over 3,000 years. When she died, that light flickered out. The gods fell silent. The Nile flowed on. And so, dear listener, our journey with Cleopatra draws to a close. Thank you for walking with me tonight through temples and palaces, through silence and storm, through the life of a woman who defied the tides of history and dared to shape an empire in her own image. Whether you drifted off somewhere along the Nile or stayed with me until the end, I'm grateful you joined me here in the quiet corridors of time. This has been the Nighttime Historian. Until next time, sleep well and let history watch over you.